An obese teen hides a wounded biker from the police, thinking she's just saving a stranger. But when the sirens fade and the engines roar, she realizes she's just started a war between the law and redemption itself. He's no ordinary man. He's a hunted ex-Hell's Angel who once rode with darkness, and now every biker in America is coming to protect him. The town calls her crazy. The cops call her a criminal. But when over 1,000 bikers flood the valley for one man's soul, kindness becomes the most dangerous act of all. As fires rise and secrets burn, one girl must decide. Will she betray the man she saved, or stand against an entire world that says she's wrong? Because in a town built on judgment, what happens when mercy rides in on 2 wheels? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The gray light of dawn crept through threadbare curtains as Sammy Wade's alarm buzzed at 5:30 in the morning. She blinked away sleep, her hand fumbling to silence the sound before it could wake her father down the hall. The springs of her old mattress creaked as she pushed herself up, each movement careful and measured. In the dim kitchen, Sammy moved with practiced quietness. The familiar rhythm of morning settled over her. Crack 3 eggs into the cast-iron pan, listen to them sizzle, watch the whites turn from clear to cloudy. The routine was as worn as the linoleum floor beneath her feet. Her father's heavy footsteps announced his arrival. Without looking up, Sammy slid the eggs onto a chipped plate, adding 2 pieces of toast she'd prepared. The smell of whiskey preceded him into the kitchen. "Mornin'," she murmured, but Chester Wade only grunted, dropping into his chair. His bloodshot eyes stayed fixed on his coffee mug, the brown liquid inside more bourbon than coffee. Sammy watched from the corner of her eye as he pushed the eggs around his plate, her own stomach growling quietly. In her bedroom, Sammy pulled on her baggiest sweater, navy blue, washed so many times it was almost gray. The mirror showed what she tried so hard to hide, curves that drew unwanted attention, a softness she couldn't seem to shed. She tugged the sweater lower, wishing she could disappear inside it completely. The walk to school felt longer each day. Sammy kept her head down, shoulders hunched against the morning chill, but it didn't help. The voices found her anyway. "Hey, Wide-Load Wade!" The nickname rang out across the parking lot. Laughter followed, sharp as needles. "Better move quick. She might eat all the cafeteria food before lunch." Another voice joined in, and Sammy's cheeks burned. She clutched her books tighter to her chest, trying to make herself smaller. The morning classes blurred together. English, where her essay came back with a red C-. History, where no one wanted to partner with her for the group project. Math, where she sat alone in the back row, numbers swimming before her eyes. Lunch was worst. Sammy found her usual spot, the far corner table where the cafeteria's fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed. She unwrapped her peanut butter sandwich, made with the last scraps from an almost empty jar. A group of girls walked past, whispers and giggles trailing in their wake. One of them, Madison Taylor, with her perfect blonde hair and cheerleading uniform, deliberately bumped Sammy's table, sending her water bottle rolling. "Oops," Madison said, voice dripping with fake concern. "Sorry, didn't see you there. Though that's pretty hard to believe, isn't it?" More laughter, more burning cheeks, more wishes to disappear. When the final bell rang, Sammy didn't take her usual route home. Instead, she climbed the ridge behind her family's weathered barn, finding the spot where tall grass and wild daisies created a natural cushion. From here, she could see Highway 9 stretching like a gray ribbon through the valley. The rumble came first, a deep, throaty sound that made her heart beat faster. Then the motorcycles appeared, chrome glinting in the afternoon sun. They moved like a leather-clad parade. Freedom on two wheels. Sammy pulled her sketchbook from her backpack, pencil flying across the paper as she captured the curves of fuel tanks, the sweep of handlebars, the proud stance of riders against the wind. At 5 o'clock, she traded her school clothes for the plain black uniform of May's diner. The bell above the door chimed steadily through her shift. Truckers wanting coffee, families ordering meatloaf specials, teenagers sharing baskets of fries. Between refilling coffee cups and clearing tables, Sammy's pencil found its way to order pad margins and napkin corners. More bikes, more dreams of open roads. "You're getting real good at those drawings," May said, peering over Sammy's shoulder as she sketched during her break. The older woman's kind words brought a rare smile to Sammy's face. The diner emptied as night fell. Sammy counted her tips, $12.35, mostly in ones, and began the walk home. Crickets chirped in the darkness, a gentle symphony that usually brought her peace. But tonight, another sound cut through their song. First, it was just a whisper on the wind, the high, lonely wail of a siren in the distance. Then another joined it, and another. The sound grew louder, closer, until red and blue lights painted the trees along Highway 9 in artificial colors. Sammy stood frozen at the end of her driveway, watching as more emergency vehicles raced past, their urgency filling the quiet night with warning. Her heart pounded as the sirens wailed closer to her home. Something was wrong. Something big enough to draw every emergency vehicle in their small town. The crickets fell silent, as if they too sensed the change in the air. Sammy clutched her backpack tighter, rooted to the spot as the night, transformed from its usual peaceful quiet into something electric with tension and uncertainty. The familiar drone of crickets was completely drowned out now by the approaching chaos. More sirens joined the chorus. Police, ambulance, fire trucks, their lights turning the dark country road into a festival of emergency red and blue. Sammy could feel the vibration of heavy vehicles in her chest as they roared past, each one adding to the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. The procession seemed endless. Through gaps in the trees, Sammy caught glimpses of official vehicles she'd never seen before. Black SUVs with tinted windows, trucks with equipment she didn't recognize. The night air carried snippets of radio chatter, urgent voices calling codes she didn't understand. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably May checking to make sure she'd made it home safe, like she did most nights. But Sammy couldn't look away from the stream of emergency vehicles long enough to check. Something was happening, something big enough to shatter the usual quiet of their rural community. The sirens continued their urgent song, and Sammy stood witness to whatever emergency was unfolding beyond her view. The warm spring night had turned into something else entirely. A moment when the ordinary world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sammy's hands trembled slightly as she turned the key in the diner's front door lock. The clock on the wall inside showed 12:15 in the morning. Another late night closing up alone. May had offered to stay, but Sammy had insisted she head home early to care for her sick grandson. The parking lot stood empty, except for the ancient pickup truck her father had grudgingly let her use. Fluorescent lights from the nearby gas station cast everything in a sickly glow, creating long shadows that made ordinary things look menacing. She'd done this 100 times before, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the sirens from earlier, or maybe just the unusual stillness in the air. A sudden crash from the alley behind the diner made her jump. Metal clanged against concrete, probably just another raccoon knocking over the dumpster lids. But then came a different sound. Labored breathing, heavy footsteps. Sammy froze, keys still dangling from her fingers. A massive shape emerged from behind the dumpsters, moving unsteadily in the dim light. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the figure stumbled into view. A man, huge and intimidating, with a thick beard and leather vest. Blood stained his white t-shirt, and one hand pressed against his side. Their eyes met. Sammy's instinct screamed at her to run, but something in his gaze held her in place. Pain clouded his features. Yes, but there was something else there. A desperate plea for help that struck straight to her heart. "Please," he rasped, his voice rough but quiet. "I need somewhere to hide." He swayed slightly, steadying himself against the wall. "Name's Luke. I ain't gonna hurt you, girl. Just need to lay low for a bit." Before Sammy could respond, flashlight beams cut through the darkness at the far end of the alley. Voices carried on the night air, police radios crackling, boots on pavement. "This way," someone shouted. "Check behind the businesses." Luke's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. Sammy's mind raced. This man was clearly running from the law. Helping him would be wrong, dangerous even. But that look in his eyes, it wasn't the look of someone evil. It was the look of someone lost, hurting, afraid, just like she so often felt herself. Her hands moved before her brain could stop them, fitting the key back into the kitchen door. "Quick," she whispered, holding it open. "Through here." Luke limped inside, and Sammy quickly locked the door behind them. She led him through the dark kitchen, her heart pounding with every step. The flashlight beams swept past the windows as they crouched low, moving carefully between the industrial refrigerator and prep tables. "There's a back door," she whispered. "It leads to a path through the woods. My family's property is just beyond there." They slipped out into the night. Sammy guided Luke along the narrow dirt trail, supporting some of his weight when he stumbled. The path wound through thick trees, eventually opening up near her family's old barn. The worn structure loomed against the star-filled sky, a familiar sight that now felt strange and secret. Her grandfather's barn had stood mostly empty since his passing 3 years ago. The musty space still held some old farm equipment, stacks of hay bales, and a small loft area where she sometimes went to read or draw. Now it would serve a very different purpose. "Up here," she murmured, helping Luke climb the wooden ladder to the loft. He moved slowly, clearly in pain, but managed to make it without making too much noise. The space was small but dry, with enough room to lie down. "Let me look at that wound," Sammy said, pulling out her phone for light. Luke carefully lifted his shirt, revealing an angry gash along his ribs. It wasn't as deep as all the blood had suggested, but it definitely needed attention. "Stay here," she whispered. "I'll be right back." Sammy crept into her house, heart in her throat as she gathered supplies. The first aid kit from under the bathroom sink, some clean towels, a bottle of water, and one of her father's old blankets from the hall closet. Her father's snores echoed from his bedroom. Thank goodness he'd passed out early again. Back in the barn, she cleaned Luke's wound as best she could with antiseptic wipes, trying not to flinch at his sharp intake of breath. Her hands shook slightly as she applied gauze and medical tape, but the motions felt familiar. She'd had plenty of practice patching up her own scrapes and bruises over the years. "Thank you," Luke muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "You're taking one hell of a risk for a stranger." Sammy spread the blanket over him, tucking it around his massive frame. "Sometimes strangers are the ones who need help the most," she replied softly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Luke's eyes were already growing heavy, the pain and exhaustion clearly taking their toll. "You're either real brave or real foolish, girl," he mumbled as he drifted off. "Maybe both." Sammy sat back against a hay bale, watching his chest rise and fall in the dim light filtering through the barn's weathered boards. What had she done? This man could be dangerous, probably was dangerous, given how he was running from the police. Yet something deep in her gut told her she'd made the right choice. The old barn creaked and settled around them, its familiar sounds somehow comforting despite the strangeness of the situation. In the distance, sirens continued their wailing song, but they seemed to be moving further away, fading into the hills as false dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of gray. Luke's breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep, though his face remained tense even in unconsciousness. Sammy pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she kept watch. The gravity of what she'd done began to sink in. She'd hidden a fugitive, treated his wounds, given him shelter. If anyone found out... The first true rays of sunlight began to peek through the cracks in the barn walls, casting long shadows across the loft floor. Sammy hadn't slept at all, her mind too full of questions and worries. What would happen when Luke woke up? What if the police came searching? What had he done to be running in the first place? The barn's old timbers groaned softly in the morning breeze, as if sharing her concerns. But there was no going back now. For better or worse, she'd made her choice. All she could do was hope that the trust she'd placed in a stranger's pleading eyes hadn't been misplaced. Dawn broke fully over the Tennessee hills, painting the world in soft golden light. The sirens had finally fallen silent, leaving only the gentle sounds of morning birds and rustling leaves. Sammy watched the sunrise through a gap in the wooden slats, wondering what the new day would bring. The early morning sun had barely crested the hills when Sammy crept from her bedroom. Her father's thunderous snores echoed through the thin walls. Another hangover morning meant she could move freely. She tiptoed to the kitchen, gathering what food she could. 2 apples, half a loaf of bread, some cheese slices, and a bottle of water. In the bathroom, her hands trembled as she opened the medicine cabinet. Her father's prescription painkillers sat in the back corner, prescribed after his workplace injury last year. He hadn't taken them much, preferring his liquid medicine instead. Sammy hesitated only a moment before pocketing 3 pills. The morning dew soaked through her sneakers as she made her way to the barn. Inside, the familiar, musty scent mixed with something new, antiseptic and sweat. Luke was already awake, sitting up against the hay bales, his massive frame making the loft space seem smaller. "Brought you something to eat," Sammy said softly, laying out the modest breakfast. "And these might help with the pain." She held out the pills. Luke studied them before accepting. "Much obliged." His voice was gravelly, tired. "Name's Luke Hanlon, by the way. Some folks call me Grizzly." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Guess you can figure why." Sammy nodded, taking in his wild beard and broad shoulders. Despite his intimidating size, there was something gentle in the way he handled the food, eating slowly and deliberately. "I need to ask," she ventured, wringing her hands. "What happened last night? The police." Luke was quiet for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully. "Reckon you deserve to know, considering the risk you're taking." He set down the half-eaten apple. "I used to ride with the Hells Angels. Done things I ain't proud of. Things that'll haunt me till the day I die." Sammy's heart quickened, but she stayed still, listening. 2 nights ago, I found out some of the boys were running something worse than drugs." His jaw tightened. "They had this girl, couldn't have been more than 12 years old, trafficking her." The word came out like poison. I couldn't let that stand." He rubbed his face with calloused hands. "Got her out, got her to safety, but their enforcer, man named Snake, caught up to us. There was a fight." Luke's eyes grew distant. He pulled a knife. I didn't mean to. But he's dead now. Sammy's breath caught in her throat. She should be terrified. This man was a confessed killer, a former gang member. But all she could see was the pain in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his actions. The police think I murdered him in cold blood, Luke continued. Maybe I deserve whatever's coming to me, but that little girl, she's safe now. That's what matters. You saved her, Sammy said quietly. Luke looked at her then, really looked at her. Yeah, but at what cost? The morning wore on, and Sammy had to leave for her shift at the diner. The lunch rush was in full swing, conversations buzzing like angry bees. She moved between tables, coffee pot in hand, catching snippets of gossip. Heard he's ex-Hells Angels. Killed a man with his bare hands. Devil on wheels, that's what they're saying. Her hands shook slightly as she refilled mugs, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. These people, her neighbors, saw only a monster. But she'd seen something else in those haunted eyes. Regret, remorse, maybe even a flicker of hope. The day dragged on endlessly. When her shift finally ended, rain had begun to fall, drumming against the diner's windows. By the time she reached the barn, it was pouring, the valley echoing with thunder. Luke sat in the dim light of her battery-powered lantern, looking somehow both massive and vulnerable. Used to live for the ride, he said as she settled onto a hay bale. The power of it, the fear in people's eyes when we rolled through their towns. Thought that made me strong. He traced a finger through the dust beside him. Found faith in prison, if you can believe it. Chaplain there, he showed me a different kind of strength. But by the time I understood, felt like it was too late for someone like me. Maybe not too late, Sammy said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Luke's head bowed, his massive shoulders seeming to carry the weight of all his years. Maybe, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. God sent me to you. Been running so long, trying to outride my sins. Never thought I'd find grace in a barn from a girl nobody sees. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the roof, providing cover for their quiet conversation. Neither of them heard the truck engine idling somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn, its presence hidden by the storm. Sammy sat with Luke as the evening deepened, sharing the simple dinner she'd managed to smuggle from home. Despite the fear and uncertainty hanging over them, there was something peaceful about the moment. Two lonely souls finding unexpected understanding in the midst of chaos. The lantern cast long shadows across the barn's weathered walls as they talked in low voices about faith, redemption, and the strange paths that had brought them to this point. Outside, the rain showed no signs of letting up, its steady rhythm punctuated by occasional rumbles of thunder. Luke spoke of his years with the motorcycle gang, of the gradual awakening of his conscience, and of the final desperate act that had set him on this path of redemption. Sammy listened, offering neither judgment nor absolution, just the quiet acceptance that seemed to be what he needed most. The morning sun had barely crept over the Tennessee hills when Sammy heard it, a low rumble in the distance, like approaching thunder. She was at the diner, wiping down tables for the breakfast rush, when the first motorcycles appeared on the horizon. They came in waves, first dozens, then hundreds of chrome-plated machines thundering down Main Street. The sound was deafening, a symphony of engines that shook the windows and made coffee cups dance in their saucers. Customers abandoned their half-eaten breakfasts, pressing against the glass or spilling out onto the sidewalk to stare at the spectacle. "Sweet Lord above," Martha, the cook, whispered as she joined the crowd outside. "I ain't never seen anything like this." The bikes kept coming. They filled the streets, lined the parking lots, stretched as far as the eye could see. Leather-clad riders, patches gleaming on their vests, dismounted and stood in disciplined formation. The townspeople huddled together, mothers pulling children close, men trying to look brave despite their trembling hands. Inside the diner, Jerry, Sammy's boss, clicked on the ancient television mounted above the counter. The screen flickered to life, showing news anchor Diane Holt standing on what Sammy recognized as Highway 9, just outside town. "We're live in rural Tennessee," Diane announced, her professional demeanor barely masking her amazement, "where an extraordinary scene is unfolding. More than 1,000 motorcycle riders have descended on this quiet valley, all rallying around one name, Luke Hanlon." Sammy's heart stopped. The camera panned across the sea of bikes and riders. These bikers, representing clubs from across the country, claim Hanlon is innocent of murder charges stemming from an incident last week. They say he was protecting a trafficking victim and acted in self-defense. The diner erupted in whispers. Sammy's hands shook as she gripped the counter for support. On screen, a gruff-looking biker with gray-streaked hair was speaking into Diane's microphone. "Grizzly's a hero," the man declared. "He did what any decent human being would do. We're not leaving until justice is served." The morning wore on, and the tension in town grew thicker than summer humidity. Police cars began arriving, their sirens mixing with the constant rumble of idling motorcycles. Sammy watched it all through the diner windows, her secret feeling heavier with each passing minute. Shortly after noon, Sheriff Wilson's cruiser turned onto the dirt road leading to her family's farm. 2 state police vehicles followed close behind, kicking up clouds of dust. Sammy's heart raced. She had to get home. "Jerry," she called out, already untying her apron. "I need to go." Her boss just nodded, too entranced by the television coverage to argue. Sammy ran all the way home, her lungs burning. As she crested the final hill, she saw the police cars parked in front of their house. Her father stood on the porch, arms crossed, face set in stone as Sheriff Wilson spoke to him. She got close enough to hear the sheriff's words, carried on the wind. "Harboring a fugitive is a federal crime, Tom. Could mean serious jail time. If you know anything..." Before her father could respond, the sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air. Dozens of bikes appeared, forming a protective circle around the property. The police officers reached for their weapons, but held their fire as more bikers arrived, then more, until the Wade farm was surrounded by a wall of chrome and leather. "Stop!" A deep voice boomed across the yard. Luke emerged from the barn, hands raised. He looked stronger than he had days ago, though his side still clearly pained him. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." The police trained their weapons on him. "Luke Hanlon," Sheriff Wilson called out, "you're under arrest for the murder of James Snake Martinez." "I know," Luke replied calmly. "I'm surrendering. Just let these people be. They had nothing to do with this." But as he started walking towards the police, the bikers revved their engines in unison. The sound was deafening, drowning out the sheriff's commands. Then, one voice started chanting, quickly joined by others until hundreds of voices thundered across the valley. "Ride for mercy! Ride for mercy!" Sammy stood frozen between the porch and the barn, watching as more bikers arrived. The chant grew louder, powerful enough to shake the very ground. She saw news anchor Diane Holt's van pull up, cameramen scrambling to capture the scene. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As dusk settled over the valley, hundreds of motorcycle headlights clicked on, creating a ring of light around the farm. The glow was otherworldly, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. Luke stood in the yard, bathed in that orange light, looking both powerful and vulnerable. The police hadn't lowered their weapons, but they hadn't advanced either. The bikers continued their chant, their voices carrying across the hills like a prayer. Sammy found herself moving forward, stepping into the space between Luke and the police. She felt the weight of both law and love pressing in on her from all sides. There was no going back now, no pretending she hadn't chosen a side. The simple act of kindness that had led her to help a wounded stranger had sparked something far bigger than herself, a movement of redemption that had brought thousands to their sleepy valley. The headlights blazed brighter as darkness crept in, casting long shadows across the ground. Sammy stood her ground, her heart pounding but her feet firmly planted. Behind her, she could hear Luke's steady breathing. Before her, she saw the uncertainty in the officers' eyes as they faced not just one fugitive, but an army of supporters demanding justice with their presence and their voices. The valley glowed with the light of countless motorcycles, a beacon visible for miles around. In that moment, suspended between day and night, between right and wrong, between fear and faith, Sammy knew she was exactly where she needed to be, standing for mercy, no matter the cost. The morning sun rose over a town transformed. News vans lined Highway 9 like a parade of white and blue boxes, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Reporters clutched microphones and coffee cups, broadcasting live updates to viewers across the country. Sheriff Dan Riker stood at the town hall steps, his weathered face grim as he addressed the growing crowd. Due to the unprecedented situation, I'm declaring a temporary lockdown. All businesses will close at sunset. We need everyone to remain calm and stay home until this situation resolves itself. But Sammy Wade wasn't staying home. She marched right up to the sheriff, her hands trembling but her voice steady. Luke deserves to tell his side of the story. He saved that girl's life. Someone needs to listen. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. Sammy, I understand you want to help, but harboring a fugitive. He's not just a fugitive, she interrupted. He's a human being who did the right thing, even though it cost him everything. Back at the diner, Tanya Miller watched the exchange on the mounted television, shaking her head in amazement. In all the years she'd known Sammy, she'd never seen such fire in the girl's eyes. When Sammy returned to grab some supplies, Tanya grabbed her arm. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Tanya asked. Sammy nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." "Then I'm in," Tanya said, already reaching for her car keys. "Let's feed these people." Together they organized a makeshift food distribution system. Tanya's pickup truck became their mobile kitchen, delivering sandwiches and coffee to the bikers who had transformed the empty fields into an impromptu campground. The scene was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Leather-clad men and women setting up tents, stringing lights between trees, and building fire pits for cooking. What surprised the townspeople most was how organized everything was. The bikers designated quiet hours, set up recycling stations, and even started a volunteer security patrol to keep the peace. Children from nearby houses began sneaking closer, drawn by the rumble of engines and the smell of grilled food. "Who wants to sit on a real Harley?" A gray-haired biker called out to a group of wide-eyed kids. Their parents, watching nervously from porches, slowly realized these weren't the monsters they'd imagined. As the days passed, more locals began bringing food and supplies. Mrs. Johnson from the bakery arrived with 3 dozen fresh rolls. Mr. Peters, the hardware store owner, donated tarps when rain threatened. Slowly, the barrier between them and us began to crack. At the Wade farm, Luke spent his days helping with repairs he'd noticed needed doing. One evening, as the sun set, he and Sammy's father sat on the porch steps, sharing a bottle of root beer. "Never thought I'd be sharing a drink with a Hell's Angel," Tom Wade said, but there was no edge to his words. Luke took a long sip before answering. "Former Hell's Angel. That life's behind me now, thanks to your daughter." He paused, watching Sammy help some bikers set up a new tent. "Your girl has more courage than half the men I've ever known." Tom nodded slowly. "She gets that from her mother." His voice grew quiet. Margaret would have done the same thing, standing up for what's right no matter what anyone thought. As night fell, Sammy sat cross-legged in her room, her laptop glowing in the darkness. She'd spent hours writing and rewriting her script, wanting to get every word perfect. Finally, she clicked the record button. "Hi, I'm Samantha Wade," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I want to tell you the truth about Luke Hanlon. Not the story you've heard on the news, but what really happened. About a man who saw something wrong and couldn't look away. About a 12-year-old girl who needed someone to fight for her. About redemption and the price of doing what's right." She talked for 15 minutes, her words flowing from her heart. She described finding Luke that night, seeing the pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. She talked about the girl he'd saved, about his decision to leave his old life behind, about the cost of choosing mercy over violence. When she finished recording, she sat back, her hands steady as she uploaded the video. The stars sparkled through her window, countless points of light in the darkness. As she watched the upload progress bar move forward, she thought about how one small act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives she'd never even imagined. Down in the fields, the bikers' campfires dotted the landscape like earthbound stars. The sound of quiet conversations and occasional laughter drifted up on the night breeze. It was a strange peace, this standoff between law and conscience, but in that moment, watching her video begin to spread across the internet, Sammy felt a deep certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. In just a few hours, her video would reach thousands, then hundreds of thousands of viewers. The truth about Luke Hanlon would finally be heard, not from news reports or police statements, but from a 17-year-old girl who had looked past appearances to see the heart of a man seeking redemption. "Video uploaded successfully," flashed across her screen. Sammy closed her laptop and walked to the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape below. The campfires, the news vans, the circles of bikers sharing meals and stories. It was all because she'd chosen to believe in someone when no one else would. The night air was cool on her face as she watched her quiet act of mercy grow into something that would change not just one life, but an entire community. Sammy's video spread like wildfire across social media. Within 48 hours, her heartfelt plea had touched millions of hearts. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, each ping representing another share, another comment, another person moved by her courage to stand up for what she believed in. "Look at this," Tanya said during their morning shift at the diner, holding up her phone. "You're trending on Twitter. Obese teen hides fugitive to save his life. That's the headline everyone's sharing." Sammy winced at the word obese, but forced a smile. Even when trying to do good, people couldn't help but point out her size. Still, the support pouring in was overwhelming. Comments flooded her social media accounts. "You're an angel in disguise, Sammy. This girl has more courage than our entire justice system. Reckless teenager endangering her community. God bless you for showing such mercy." The diner had become an unofficial headquarters for supporters. Regular customers mixed with journalists, all wanting to hear Sammy's story firsthand. She'd lost count of how many times she'd explained why she'd helped Luke that night, each telling making her more certain she'd done the right thing. By mid-afternoon, a PayPal account set up by well-wishers had collected over $10,000. People wanted to support their cause, to help Luke clear his name and expose the trafficking ring he'd fought against. "Miss Wade," a deep voice called from the diner's entrance. Sammy looked up to see a tall man in a leather vest, his gray beard neatly trimmed, a clerical collar visible beneath his jacket. "I'm Reverend Clay Burton. Mind if we talk?" They sat in a quiet booth, away from the curious eyes. Clay's weathered face crinkled with kindness as he spoke. "I rode with the angels years ago," he said, stirring his coffee. "Before I found my calling, when I heard about Luke, about what you're doing here, I knew I had to come." Reverend Clay's plan was simple but powerful, a peaceful march through town, showing that bikers could stand for justice without violence. "Let's show them what mercy looks like," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Besides, I hear you could use a little spiritual guidance around here." That evening, Sammy and Luke addressed the growing crowd from the farmhouse porch. Luke's voice, though still rough from his injuries, carried across the gathered faces. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he admitted. "But saving that little girl, that was God's grace working through me. And Sammy?" He turned to her, his eyes misting. "She showed me that same grace when I needed it most." Sammy stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the porch railing. "We're not asking you to forget the law," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We're asking you to remember mercy, to remember that sometimes doing what's right means standing up for someone everyone else has condemned." The crowd erupted in cheers and the rumble of motorcycle engines. For the first time in her life, Sammy felt truly seen. Not as the overweight girl who tried to disappear, but as someone whose voice mattered, whose actions could make a difference. But not everyone celebrated their message of hope. In his patrol car, Deputy Carl Jansen watched the scene with growing anger. His phone buzzed, another message from his real employers, the trafficking ring Luke had exposed. They wanted results, and soon. "It's being handled," he texted back, his jaw clenched. Years of carefully constructed corruption were threatening to unravel because of one ex-biker's conscience and a teenager's misplaced compassion. As night fell and the crowd dispersed, Jansen parked his car in the shadows behind the Wade property. He watched through binoculars as Sammy helped Luke back to his cot in the barn. The girl had been sleeping there too, keeping watch over her injured fugitive. Once the lights dimmed and silence settled over the farm, Jansen moved. The weight of the gas can felt heavy in his hands as he crept toward the barn. Moonlight glinted off his badge as he carefully poured gasoline along the weathered wooden walls, the fumes rising in the cool night air. Inside, Sammy slept peacefully on a hay bale, while Luke's steady breathing came from his cot nearby. Neither heard the splash of accelerant or smelled its deadly promise. They had no idea that their sanctuary was about to become a trap. The corrupt deputy worked methodically, ensuring the old wood would catch quickly. In his mind, he justified it as necessary. A tragic accident that would solve all his problems. No witnesses, no evidence, no threat to his carefully constructed world of bribes and betrayal. He circled the entire barn, the gas can growing lighter with each step. The night was still, perfect for his terrible purpose. Through the barn's weather-worn slats, he could see Sammy shift in her sleep, completely unaware of the danger surrounding her. Luke's words from earlier echoed mockingly in Jansen's head. God's grace working through me. Well, tonight would show what happened to people who thought they could challenge the natural order of things. Tonight would prove that sometimes darkness won. The empty gas can dangled from his fingers as he completed his grim task. The barn stood silent, its occupants sleeping peacefully, unaware that their refuge was about to become their prison. Deputy Carl Jansen stood in the shadows, ready to strike the match that would silence their voices forever. The first tongue of flame licked across the barn's roof like a demon's finger reaching for the stars. Inside, Sammy stirred in her sleep, her nose twitching at an acrid smell that didn't belong. Smoke curled through the wooden slats, thickening with each passing second. Her eyes snapped open as the first crackling sounds echoed above. "Fire!" The word tore from her throat, raw and desperate. "Luke, wake up!" The barn was already filling with choking black smoke. Through watering eyes, she saw Luke struggling to sit up on his cot, his injured ribs slowing his movements, the heat pressed down on them like a physical weight. "Get to the door!" Luke's voice was barely audible over the roar of flames that now engulfed the entire roof. Sammy stumbled toward him, coughing violently as the smoke burned her lungs. Her oversized sweater caught on a nail, and she yanked it free, feeling the fabric tear. Luke's strong hand found her shoulder, pushing her ahead of him. "Move, girl. Don't stop for anything." The temperature was rising fast, making the air shimmer like a mirage. Behind them, burning hay bales cast hellish shadows on the walls. Outside, the night exploded into chaos. Sammy's father burst from the house, still in his undershirt, bellowing her name. Neighbors poured from their homes, drawn by the orange glow that lit up the valley like a false dawn. The sound of motorcycle engines roared as bikers who'd been camping nearby raced towards the inferno. "Form a line," someone shouted. "Get those buckets moving!" A human chain materialized, passing buckets of water from hand to hand, but it was like trying to fight a forest fire with teardrops. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames shooting 50 feet into the night sky. Sammy and Luke reached the barn door, only to find it stuck fast. Luke threw his shoulder against it once, twice, his face contorted in pain from his injuries. The wood groaned, but held. "Stand back," Luke ordered, gathering what strength he had left. He rammed the door a third time, and finally, it burst open with a shower of sparks. But in that moment, a terrible cracking sound came from above. Luke looked up, his eyes widening. Without hesitation, he grabbed Sammy by the waist and literally threw her through the doorway. She hit the ground rolling, feeling the heat of the flames singe her hair and clothes. "Luke!" she screamed, trying to scramble back toward the barn. But strong arms, her father's, caught her and pulled her away just as the roof collapsed with a thunderous roar. A wall of sparks and burning debris rained down where she had been standing seconds before. "No!" The word tore from her throat as she fought against her father's grip. "We have to help him! Luke!" The world spun, dark spots dancing at the edges of her vision. She was dimly aware of voices shouting, of water hissing as it hit burning wood, of her father's arms still holding her tight. Then everything faded to black. When Sammy opened her eyes again, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room made her squint. The steady beep of monitors filled the air, and the sharp smell of antiseptic replaced the memory of smoke. Her arms and face stung. Second-degree burns, she would later learn. "Sammy?" Her father's voice was thick with emotion. She turned her head to see him sitting beside her bed, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. He looked older somehow, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I thought, when I saw the barn..." His voice broke. For the first time in years, she watched her father weep openly. His calloused hand gripped hers gently, mindful of her bandages. "I'm so sorry, baby girl, for everything. For not being there, for not seeing you." Before Sammy could respond, the door opened and 2 men in dark suits entered. Federal agents, they introduced themselves, here about Luke Hanlon and Deputy Carl Jansen. "We need your statement, Miss Wade," the older agent said kindly. "Everything you know about Luke, about the trafficking ring, about what happened at the barn." So Sammy told them everything. How Luke had saved that young girl from the traffickers. How Deputy Jansen had been spotted near the barn just before the fire. How Luke had sacrificed himself to save her life. The agents exchanged meaningful looks. "We found Deputy Jansen's fingerprints on a gas can near the scene," the younger agent revealed, "and cell phone records showing his connection to the trafficking network. Your testimony is the final piece we needed." Hours later, as Sammy drifted in and out of consciousness, she heard excited voices in the hallway. Through her half-open door, she caught fragments of conversation. Jansen in custody, trafficking ring exposed, multiple arrests. Then another voice, familiar and gruff, made her heart leap. "Just let me see her for a minute before you take me in." Luke appeared in her doorway, supported by 2 officers. His face was covered in soot and burns, but he was alive. He limped to her bedside, his hands cuffed in front of him. "They're taking me to county," he said softly. "Got to answer for my past before I can have any kind of future." His large hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You were my second chance, Sammy. You showed me what real courage looks like." Tears slid down Sammy's cheeks as the officers led Luke away. She turned toward the window, where the rising sun was burning away the last wisps of smoke from the valley. The barn was gone. Luke was heading to jail, and nothing would ever be the same. But uncertainty wasn't always a bad thing, she realized. Sometimes it meant that old things had to burn away before new life could begin. She watched a flock of birds wheel against the brightening sky, free and unafraid, and allowed herself to hope. The August heat rippled across the courthouse steps as Sammy smoothed down the navy blazer someone had left on her front porch. The tag still hung inside. "For our angel," it read, making her eyes mist over. 6 weeks had passed since the fire, but some mornings she still woke up gasping, the phantom smell of smoke in her nostrils. Her burns had healed into pink, shiny patches along her arms and neck. The doctors said the scars would fade with time, but Sammy didn't mind them much anymore. They were proof she'd done something that mattered. "Ready, sweetheart?" her father asked, holding out his arm. Their relationship had changed since that night in the hospital. He'd stopped drinking, started really seeing her. Sometimes she caught him just watching her with a mixture of pride and regret that made her heart ache. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors echoed with heavy boots. Dozens of bikers filled the benches, each one wearing pressed suits and ties that looked strange against their tattoos and weathered faces. The Angels of Mercy, they called themselves now. They'd stayed in town these past weeks, helping rebuild the barn, organizing charity rides, showing everyone that redemption wasn't just a word. Tanya, her best friend from the diner, squeezed her hand as they found their seats. "Look at all these people," she whispered. The courtroom was packed. Sammy recognized faces that used to turn away from her in school hallways, people who'd whispered cruel names behind her back. Now they nodded respectfully. Some even smiled. When Luke was let in, Sammy's breath caught. He looked smaller somehow in his orange jumpsuit, but his eyes were clear and calm. He'd lost weight during his weeks in county jail, his beard neatly trimmed now. When he saw her, the corner of his mouth lifted in that familiar half-smile. The trial moved quickly at first, opening statements, evidence presentations, witness after witness. Deputy Jansen's involvement in the trafficking ring had blown the case wide open. 3 more officers had been arrested, and the missing girl Luke had saved was safely back with her family. When they called Sammy to the stand, her legs felt like rubber. The walk to the witness box seemed to take forever. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, the jury, the judge, the reporters scribbling in their notebooks. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor said kindly. "Samantha Marie Wade." Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "Miss Wade, please tell us about the night you first met Luke Hanlon." So she did. She told them about the crash in the alley, about seeing something in Luke's eyes that made her trust him. She described hiding him in the barn, bringing him food, listening to his story. When she got to the part about the fire, her voice wavered. "He saved my life," she said simply. "He could have run, but he made sure I got out first." The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint her as naive, manipulated. "You harbored a known criminal, Miss Wade. Put your whole town at risk. What made you think you knew better than law enforcement?" Sammy felt something steel itself inside her. She sat up straighter, meeting the attorney's eyes. "If saving a child makes you guilty, then I guess we're all guilty. Luke did what was right when everyone else looked away. He taught me that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." A murmur ran through the courtroom. She saw several jury members nodding. The deliberation lasted 3 days. Sammy barely slept, barely ate. The Angels of Mercy kept vigil outside the courthouse, their bikes lined up like silent guardians. On the morning of the 4th day, the jury returned. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Sammy sagged against her father, tears streaming down her face. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." The judge sentenced Luke to 18 months in state prison, with credit for time served. It could have been so much worse, but Sammy's heart still felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The celebration outside was bittersweet. Bikers hugged each other, shook hands with townspeople who'd once feared them. Someone started singing Amazing Grace, the deep voices carrying across the courthouse lawn. But all too soon, it was time. 2 officers appeared to take Luke to begin his sentence. He hugged Reverend Clay, shook hands with Sammy's father, then turned to her. "Your Honor," he asked the judge, "may I have a moment?" The judge nodded, and Luke walked over to where Sammy stood. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Keep riding, kid," he said softly. "Don't let the world change you." Sammy threw her arms around him, not caring who saw. "I'll write to you," she promised. "Every week." "I know you will." He squeezed her once more, then stepped back, holding out his wrists for the cuffs. Sammy watched as they led him away, his head held high. The heavy steel doors at the end of the corridor seemed to move in slow motion. Just before they closed, Luke turned back one last time. Then he was gone, leaving Sammy standing in the sudden silence, her heart full of both loss and hope. The courthouse slowly emptied, but Sammy stayed, staring at those steel doors. She touched the scars on her arms, remembering the night that had changed everything. Luke had taught her that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what's right even when you're terrified. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to change the world. The autumn chill settled over the Tennessee Valley as Sammy Wade walked through the high school doors for the first time in 3 months. Her steps were slower now, the limp from her injuries still evident, but she carried herself differently. Gone was the hunched posture and downcast eyes. Instead, she moved with quiet confidence, her head held high. The whispers that followed her were different, too. No more cruel jabs about her weight or awkwardness. Now they whispered about the girl who'd faced down an army of cops, the one who'd helped expose a trafficking ring, who'd survived fire to save a wanted man. In art class, Sammy pulled out her sketchbook. Her fingers moved across the paper with purpose, bringing to life images that had been burning in her mind. Motorcycles with wings, leather-clad riders with halos, angels rising from smoke and flame. Her art teacher, Mrs. Bennett, paused behind her. "These are powerful, Samantha," she said softly. "You should consider submitting them to the state art competition." Sammy managed a small smile, but her heart wasn't in it. It had been 2 weeks since Luke's last letter. Each day without word from him left an emptier space inside her. The local paper had done a feature on her story, and sometimes tourists would stop her for photos, but none of that filled the void. At home, changes were happening too. The familiar smell of whiskey no longer permeated the house. Her father had poured every bottle down the drain 3 weeks ago, replacing his evening drinks with endless cups of coffee. He spent his days at the barn, replacing rotted boards and fixing the roof that had partially collapsed in the fire. "What are you planning to do with it?" Sammy had asked him one evening. He'd wiped sweat from his forehead, considering. "Time to build for hope, not hide from it," he'd said. "Maybe make it something useful for that program your biker friends are starting." The next morning, Sammy drove her father's old pickup to Reverend Clay's new community center. The building had once been an abandoned warehouse, but now it hummed with activity. Dozens of bikers in leather vests worked alongside local volunteers, turning the space into something beautiful. Reverend Clay spotted her from across the room, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "There's our angel," he called out, walking over to give her a gentle hug. "Come see what we've done with the place." He led her through rooms being transformed into counseling offices, activity spaces, and emergency housing. In the back, a massive garage was taking shape, where bikers would repair donated vehicles for families trying to escape abuse. "This is exactly what Luke dreamed about," Clay said softly. "Mercy rides, using what we know to help others break free." Sammy traced her fingers along a freshly painted wall. "Have you heard from him?" Clay shook his head. "Not for a couple weeks, but that's normal sometimes, in there. System gets backed up, letters get delayed." She helped sort donations for a few hours, working alongside men who looked fierce, but handled children's toys and women's clothing with gentle reverence. These weren't the monsters the town had once feared. They were builders, protectors, men seeking redemption through service. As evening approached, Sammy climbed into her truck for the drive home. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, reminding her of motorcycle headlights on that first night of chaos. She whispered a prayer into the gathering darkness. "Lord, please watch over him. Let him know he's not forgotten." The truck's headlights swept across her family's mailbox as she pulled into the driveway. She almost drove past, checking the mail had become an exercise in disappointment lately. But something made her stop. She opened the rusty door, reached inside, and found a single envelope. Her heart stuttered when she saw the official prison stamp. But this wasn't Luke's familiar handwriting. Instead, it was from the warden himself, marked urgent in bold red letters. Sammy held the envelope in trembling hands, wondering what news could be so important that the warden himself would write. The letter felt heavy with possibility, or perhaps warning, as the autumn wind rustled through the leaves around her. Sammy's hands shook as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of prison letterhead, the message brief but devastating. "Miss Wade, I regret to inform you that inmate Luke Grizzly Hanlon was involved in a serious altercation during yard exercise. He sustained multiple stab wounds and has been transferred to City Memorial Hospital in critical condition. As his listed emergency contact, you are being notified of this situation. Warden Michael Torres." The world tilted sideways. Sammy's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the wooden porch steps, the letter crushed against her chest. A sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a scream. The screen door creaked behind her as her father rushed out. "Baby girl? What's wrong?" She couldn't speak, just handed him the crumpled paper. He read it quickly, his face growing pale in the porch light. Without a word, he sat down beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Luke," she finally managed to whisper. "They stabbed him, Daddy." Inside the house, the clock ticked away endless minutes as Sammy lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Every conversation with Luke played through her mind like a movie she couldn't stop. His gruff voice telling stories in the barn, his quiet wisdom during late-night talks, the way he'd called her kid with such affection. Around midnight, her father brought her a mug of hot chocolate, something he hadn't done since she was small. He sat on the edge of her bed, his presence steady and comforting. "I keep thinking," Sammy said, her voice hoarse, "about all the times he protected me, and now when he needs protection—" "Listen here," her father said softly. "Sometimes God lets his best fighters rest. Doesn't mean he's abandoned them." Sammy turned to look at him, surprised by the gentleness in his words. "When did you get so wise about God?" He smiled sadly. "Been doing some thinking since the fire, seeing how faith changed those bikers, changed you. Maybe it's changing me too." She didn't sleep that night. As soon as dawn painted the sky pink, she was in her truck, driving the 2 hours to City Memorial Hospital. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white, prayers tumbling from her lips with every mile marker. The hospital loomed ahead, a concrete giant with windows that reflected the morning sun. Sammy parked and rushed to the information desk, her heart pounding. "I'm here to see Luke Hanlon," she said breathlessly. "I'm his emergency contact." The receptionist typed something into her computer, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hanlon is under police guard. No visitors except immediate family." "But I'm all he has," Sammy protested. "Please, I just need to know if he's okay." A security guard stepped forward, his face sympathetic but firm. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Defeated, Sammy walked back to the parking lot. She sat in her truck, tears sliding down her cheeks. Then she heard it, the distant rumble of motorcycles. They came from all directions, one by one at first, then in groups. Bikers in leather vests, their faces solemn, filled the parking lot. Some she recognized from the summer. Others were strangers, but all wore patches declaring them angels of mercy. They parked in neat rows, saying nothing, just nodding to each other in silent understanding. Within an hour, hundreds of motorcycles stood gleaming in the morning sun. Their riders formed a circle, holding candles despite the daylight. Reverend Clay appeared at Sammy's side, offering her a candle of her own. "Word travels fast in our brotherhood," he said quietly. "We may not be allowed inside, but we can still stand watch." The rumble of 1,000 idling engines filled the air like thunder, a sound that seemed to reach up to heaven itself. Sammy lit her candle, the flame dancing in the breeze. Tears streamed freely now as she thought of the man who'd changed so many lives, who'd taught her that redemption was possible for anyone. "Ride with the angels, Grizzly," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind as the engines growled their own prayer into the morning sky. 30 days changed everything in their small Tennessee town. What began as whispers of hope turned into bold statements of faith, painted across brick walls and storefronts. Local artists worked through nights, creating murals that captured Sammy's gentle smile and Luke's weathered face, their story told in vivid colors and careful brushstrokes. Children pedaled up and down sidewalks on shiny bikes, proudly displaying hand-painted Angels of Mercy logos on their fenders. Some wore tiny leather vests their parents had made, mimicking the bikers who'd become hometown heroes. The autumn air crackled with excitement as Reverend Clay's first Mercy rally took shape in the town square. Booths lined the streets, selling homemade goods to raise money for domestic violence shelters. The smell of barbecue and fresh-baked pies drifted through the crowd as hundreds gathered around the makeshift stage. Sammy stood at the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded her speech. She looked different now, stronger, taller somehow, though her eyes still held that same gentle light. "Hope isn't just a word," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It's what happens when we choose love over fear, when we see past what people seem to be and into who they could become." The crowd listened intently as she spoke about second chances and the power of forgiveness. But when she reached Luke's name, her voice caught. "Luke taught me that." She paused, swallowing hard. "That even in our darkest moments—" A low rumble interrupted her words. At first it seemed distant, like approaching thunder. The crowd turned toward Highway 9, where a line of motorcycles appeared on the horizon. Leading them was something different, a massive black trike, its chrome gleaming in the sunlight. Sammy's hand flew to her mouth as the convoy drew closer. There, sitting tall despite his obvious weakness, was Luke. His beard was grayer, his face thinner, but his eyes sparkled with that familiar light. The right leg of his jeans was pinned up, empty, a permanent reminder of the prison attack that had nearly taken his life. The crowd parted as the trike rolled to a stop. Sammy couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Luke smiled that crooked smile of his, and she broke into a run, tears streaming down her face. He opened his arms, and she fell into them, sobbing against his leather vest. "You didn't save me, kid," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved all of us." The crowd erupted in cheers and tears. Bikers revved their engines. In celebration, the sound echoing off buildings and hills. Above them, the autumn sun painted everything in gold, glinting off chrome and tears alike as Sammy and Luke held on to each other. Two souls who'd found family in the most unlikely place. The seasons turned like wheels on the highway, bringing change to the sleepy Tennessee Valley. The once quiet diner now buzzed with life every morning. Chrome motorcycles lined up outside like loyal steeds. Inside, Sammy moved between tables with confidence, her smile bright as she served plates piled high with eggs and bacon. Her father, clear-eyed and proud, worked the grill, trading jokes with leather-clad bikers who'd become more like family than customers. Every Wednesday morning, the place filled to bursting for what locals called biker breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee and friendship filled the air as stories flowed freely between townspeople and riders. Where there was once fear, now there was fellowship. The barn, once scarred by flames, stood tall again on the Wade property. Its fresh red paint gleamed in the sunlight, and a hand-carved sign read Hope Rides Youth Center. Inside, teenagers gathered to share their troubles and dreams, finding understanding in the most unexpected places. Sammy's artistic talent had bloomed into something beautiful. Her book, Ride for Mercy, sat proudly displayed in the diner's window. The pages held more than just sketches. They told a story of transformation through her careful lines and gentle shading. Each sale meant another $1 for the shelters that now dotted the region, safe havens built on the foundation of one girl's courage. Luke had adapted to his new life with characteristic grit. His wheelchair didn't stop him from commanding respect. If anything, it made his presence more powerful. Teens who'd been heading down dark paths found their way to his mentoring sessions, drawn by his honest stories and unwavering belief in second chances. The annual Mercy Rally had become a highlight of the year, drawing thousands from across the country. As the parade began its final run through the valley, Luke sat proud on his customized trike, the controls adapted for his needs. Sammy climbed up behind him, her hair catching the light as she waved to the cheering crowd. They rolled forward together, leading a river of chrome and compassion through the streets they'd helped transform. As they crested the hill, The setting sun turned everything to gold, two unlikely heroes disappearing into the light, living proof that redemption could ride on two wheels and one simple act of kindness. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.